Picture a vulture landing on a carcass that has been sitting in the African sun for 3 days. The animal is bloated, crawling with bacteria, decomposing in the heat. And the vulture just starts eating. No hesitation, no preparation, completely committed. Head down, wings half spread for balance. And then, nothing bad happens. The vulture finishes the meal, takes off, and does it again tomorrow. Meanwhile, a single bite of that same carcass would put a human in the hospital with septic shock. So what is actually going on? The answer, like most things in biology, isn't one thing, it's a system. A layered, interlocking set of defenses that vultures have been refining for millions of years, and it operates at a level of biological intensity that's genuinely difficult to wrap your head around. Before we get into the biology, though, it's worth being honest about something. The premise here is a little misleading, and intentionally so. Vultures do sometimes get sick. They do sometimes die from what they eat. But they survive encounters with pathogens that would be instantly lethal to almost any other animal on the planet, and the reasons why are some of the most remarkable adaptations in the entire animal kingdom. Let's start with the stomach acid, because this is where the story gets immediately extreme. On the pH scale, lower numbers mean more acidic. Human stomach acid sits at around 1.5 to 3.5. That sounds fairly strong. Dogs sit between pH 1 and 1.5, which is up to 10 times more acidic than ours, and we already talked about how that's strong enough to dissolve bone. Now take vultures. Vulture stomach acid has been measured at pH 1 to 2, with some studies recording levels closer to 1. But here's the critical difference. The volume of microbial exposure a vulture's stomach faces every single day is incomparably higher than a dog's. The system isn't just strong. It has to be strong to handle bacteria counts in decomposing flesh that would be almost unimaginable in any other dietary context. And the important part is what that acid actually does to those bacteria. Pathogens like anthrax, botulinum toxin, and Clostridium species, things that can kill large mammals outright, pass through a vulture's stomach and are neutralized. Not weakened, neutralized. The stomach functions less like a digestive organ and more like a decontamination chamber running at the absolute edge of what animal biology can produce. Researchers have looked at the microbial populations entering a vulture's gut versus what survives into the intestines, and the die-off rate is extraordinary. But the stomach isn't working alone. Here's something that doesn't get nearly enough attention. The vulture's face. Most vulture species are bald or nearly bald around the head and neck. This is usually explained as a cleanliness adaptation, and that's true, but it's only half the story. The exposed skin on a vulture's head and neck is regularly pressed deep inside carcasses, in direct contact with decomposing tissue and the bacteria living in it. What scientists have found is that vulture facial skin actually hosts a very specific microbial community of its own, one that appears to have some tolerance for, and competitive resistance to, the pathogens it's constantly encountering. The bald head isn't just about keeping feathers clean, it's a biological interface that's been optimized for exactly this kind of exposure. And here's where we encounter what may well be the most genuinely fascinating aspect of this whole picture. Inside a vulture's gut lives one of the most extreme microbial communities ever documented in a vertebrate animal. A 2014 study published in Nature Communications sequenced the microbiomes of wild vultures and found something remarkable. The bacteria that dominate the vulture gut are largely the same bacteria that dominate rotting carcasses. Fusobacteria and Clostridia, groups that are powerfully toxic in most contexts, make up a huge proportion of what's living in a healthy vulture's intestines. So what's going on? The vulture gut has essentially domesticated its enemies. Over millions of years of eating decomposing flesh, the microbial ecosystem inside these birds co-evolved with the very pathogens they were consuming. The result is a gut environment where dangerous bacteria aren't destroyed on entry, but are outcompeted, managed, and neutralized by a resident microbial community that's been shaped specifically for this purpose. It's not immunity in the conventional sense, it's ecological control. The gut microbiome functions like a very specialized standing army that knows exactly what it's fighting, because it's been fighting it for millions of years. The flip side of this is something worth sitting with. Vultures that are exposed to novel toxins, things outside the range their microbiomes have adapted to, can and do get sick. There are documented cases of vultures dying from ingesting veterinary drugs present in carcasses, particularly diclofenac, a painkiller that's devastated vulture populations across South Asia. The same system that makes them nearly invincible against bacterial decomposition can be completely undone by a synthetic compound that evolution never prepared them for. So, what's standing between us and doing any of this? That's a fair point to raise. Humans are omnivores with a long evolutionary history of eating a wide range of foods, including meat. We're not entirely without defenses, but somewhere along the line, our ancestors started doing something that changed the equation completely. They started cooking. Cooking kills pathogens before they reach the stomach, When you apply heat to meat, you're doing externally what a vulture's stomach does internally. And once that became a reliable survival strategy, there was no longer the same evolutionary pressure to maintain an extreme internal decontamination system. Our stomach acid is less aggressive, our gut microbiome is less heavily armed, and our intestinal transit is slower. We optimized for a different kind of diet. And then, on top of cooking, modern humans built refrigeration, preservatives, food safety infrastructure, and germ theory. We kept externalizing the problem instead of internalizing the solution. That strategy has worked spectacularly well. Foodborne illness deaths have collapsed in populations with access to modern food handling. But the trade-off is real. Our bodies are now calibrated for a level of microbial cleanliness that would be completely alien to a vulture. If you tried to eat what a vulture eats, you wouldn't just get sick. You'd likely be in organ failure within hours. There's also a role that the vulture's immune system plays beyond just the gut, and it deserves mention. Vultures have evolved specific immune gene variants that appear to tolerate the presence of bacterial toxins that would trigger a catastrophic inflammatory response in other animals. In most vertebrates, detecting certain bacterial compounds triggers an immune cascade that, at high enough exposure levels, causes septic shock. The immune system essentially overreacts and destroys the host. Vulture immune genes seem to have evolved a more calibrated response. They react to the threat without overreacting to the exposure. It's a system tuned for chronic, massive microbial load rather than rare, acute infection. What this means in practice is that a vulture isn't just surviving rotten meat through brute chemical force. It's surviving through a combination of acid chemistry, microbial competition, immune tolerance, and a gut community that has co-evolved with decomposition itself. Each layer handles what the previous one misses. The acid kills the majority. The gut microbiome outcompetes what survives. The immune system manages the rest without triggering a self-destructive response. And all of it sits on top of millions of years of exposure that tuned each layer specifically for this. There's a broader point here that's worth landing on, and it connects back to why vultures exist in the first place. They're not just eating because they're hungry. They're performing a function that ecosystems genuinely depend on. A carcass left to rot without scavengers becomes a reservoir of disease, spreading pathogens into soil and water and infecting other animals. Vultures are the cleanup system. The reason they can eat what they eat isn't separate from the job they do. It's the reason they're capable of doing it. The biology and the ecological role develop together, each one shaping the other over an enormous span of time. So the next time you see footage of vultures tearing into something that looks like a public health hazard, remember what's actually happening inside those birds. The acid hits first, stripping out the majority of pathogens at a pH that barely anything can survive. What gets through lands in a gut ecosystem that's been shaped specifically to handle it. A microbial community so well established that incoming bacteria have almost no room to get a foothold. And underneath all of that runs an immune system calibrated for this exact kind of exposure, tolerating what it needs to tolerate, responding to what it needs to respond to, without burning the whole system down in the process. It's not one defense. It's 4 or 5, stacked together and perfected across a time span that renders human history comparatively brief. Vultures aren't immune to the meat they eat. They're specifically, precisely, almost incomprehensibly adapted to it.